There was no anthem, no round of applause, no formal welcome, just silence. For the first time in the history of the African Union, the Grand Hall in Addis Ababa stood still. No speeches, no ceremonial introductions. Instead, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso's transitional government, walked alone to the center of the stage holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. Not a speech, but a list. A list no leader had dared to read aloud before. Victims, children gunned down at protest gates, mothers who lost their sons to stray bullets, farmers buried without a name. And then Traoré spoke only 7 words. Let us begin not with words, but with silence. The room fell into stillness. Presidents from 24 nations looked on, some confused, some already weeping. Behind the podium, no national flags, no policy graphics, just the flicker of a single candle. A symbol, quiet but defiant. This wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. For those of us who lived through the televised grief of Vietnam, of Selma, of Sandy Hook, we recognize the weight of a name spoken in public silence. And we know what it means when a leader chooses not to speak, but to feel. So we ask you this: have you ever seen a summit open not with slogans, but with mourning? Could silence be Africa's loudest cry for justice? If this moment stirs something in you, if you believe that dignity begins with remembrance, then don't just watch. Witness, share this story, speak a name, and subscribe not just for news, but for truth that lingers long after the headlines fade. The sunlight cut through the glass walls of the African Union Hall like a blade-sharp clinical almost too clean for what was about to unfold. It was a day built for diplomacy. Presidents in fine suits, ministers with talking points, interpreters adjusting earpieces. Everything followed the protocol of power until it didn't. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not wear a sash or a ceremonial medal. No entourage followed him, only a single aide holding a folded sheet of paper. When he reached the podium, there was no music, no applause, just the quiet click of the microphone coming to life. And then a sentence: let us begin not with words, but with silence. At first, people thought it was a glitch. The technicians looked nervously at each other. The interpreters froze, waiting for more, but Traoré said nothing. 1 minute, then 2. By the third, the silence wasn't just empty, it was full of weight, of tension, of unspoken grief. Delegates shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look at their phones or bow their heads. But Traoré stood still, eyes closed, not meditating, remembering. Then slowly he unfolded the paper. His voice, calm but unwavering, carried across the vast hall. He began to read Samuel Umar, aged 19, shot outside Nairobi University. Fatuma Traore, 34, disappeared near the Mopti border. Daniel Menda, 11, burned during a village raid. Issa Kante, 12, died crossing the desert. Mahmoud Diarra, 70, died waiting for food distribution, name after name. Some were old, some were babies, some were students, mothers, teachers. From Kenya, Niger, Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, all civilians, all silenced, forgotten by headlines, absent from reports. And for each name, Traoré paused, breathed, let the silence reclaim the space. In the audience, something shifted. President William Ruto of Kenya leaned forward, hands clasped. Rwanda's Paul Kagame removed his glasses. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa stared downward, jaw clenched. Even the photographers, usually aggressive, stopped clicking. The hall had become sacred. Behind Traoré, the screens displayed no flags, no documents, only candlelight. A flicker for every name. 7 minutes passed, 7 minutes without policy, without applause, without power. And when he stopped, he didn't gesture. He didn't ask for support. He simply stepped back, leaving the silence to finish what the list had begun. What was this moment? It wasn't a condemnation, but it was an indictment. Not shouted, but felt. He hadn't pointed fingers, but every leader in that hall knew these names weren't ghosts. They were consequences of failed governance, of over-militarization, of forgetting. This was no longer about border commissions or economic frameworks. It was about memory. And it was only just beginning, because the last name Traoré read out loud wasn't followed by a pause. It was followed by a letter. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a second sheet, smaller handwritten edges curled, his voice softened. My name is Miriam Wanjiku. I am the mother of Samuel Umar. I am not educated, but I write this so you know my son loved books. He wanted to teach. He never broke a law. I gave birth to him during the rain season. He died on dry ground. No one moved. No one whispered. It was no longer just a list. It was now a voice. A mother's grief not translated, not politicized, just read. And when Traore finished, he placed the letter beside the microphone. A single candle lit up behind him. One name. One flame. But in that moment, the entire continent could feel its heat. The candle hadn't even finished flickering when something appeared at the center of the front row, an empty chair. Where Kenya's cultural envoy was supposed to sit there was now only silence. Draped across the back, a plain white cloth. On the seat, a small placard with just 2 words, handwritten in quiet defiance, Samuel Umar. No announcement. No explanation. And yet everyone understood. This was not a gesture of protocol. This was mourning turned into structure. As the camera zoomed in slowly, deliberately, the entire mood shifted. This wasn't just a summit anymore. It was a vigil. And Captain Traore, returning to the podium once again, looked at the chair and said, "Symbols speak where politics falls silent." Then the lights dimmed. Behind him, the massive screen came alive, not with maps of trade corridors or charts of economic growth, but with something raw, something buried. A satellite map of the African continent. Slowly, red markers began to blink across the screen, each dot a site of civilian casualties, mass graves, unresolved massacres. Mogadishu, Maradi, Eldoret, Wahiguya, dozens, then hundreds. Within 90 seconds, the entire continent was lit up a cartography of grief. And then came the question, not shouted, not dramatized, just spoken plainly. Why has no summit shown this before? Why do these lights match the map of our gold, our oil, our cobalt? Who profits when civilians vanish and no one maps them? In the silence that followed, no one looked at their notes. No one checked their schedule. Because no one could. Even the interpreters had stopped. Then new images began to flow. A white flag fluttering above a school in Timbuktu. A mural of hand-drawn candles beneath a bullet-scarred wall in Congo. A child's crayon sketch of stick figures holding hands taped to a makeshift shelter. All real. All recent. None had made the news. Then came the objects. Along the hall's perimeter, aides began placing items, a strip of black cloth across the entrance. A banner in Swahili wanotia kimya, those who walk in silence. A glass case with a single school shoe worn cracked, missing its pair. No directive had been given, no press statement had been issued, yet the cameras knew where to focus, not on titles, not on speeches, but on things that had belonged to the forgotten. And then, one by one, the leaders moved. A delegate from Senegal crossed the floor, quietly placed a white flower on the empty chair, followed by one from Namibia. Then, from Gabon. 17 in all. No choreography. No script. They weren't performing. They were grieving. Across living rooms in Dakar, Bamako, Nairobi, people paused. Some wept. Some simply watched, silent, transfixed. On Facebook, the red-laced map was shared over 2.8 million times in 24 hours. A teacher in Kampala posted, "We taught maps for borders. Traore gave us maps for grief." And just before the session closed, someone whispered in the hall, no one knows who or how it started, but the phrase repeated quietly, reverently, "He made us see." Because this wasn't just about Samuel, or Fatuma, or Daniel. This was about remembering when the world tried to forget. It was no longer diplomacy. It was memorial. And it wasn't led by policy, it was led by silence. When Captain Traore returned to the podium for the final time that day, he did not bring more names. He brought a document. A 42-page file bound in gray, embossed with the seal of the African Union. He held it up not dramatically but plainly, letting the light catch the cover. This, he said, is not just a policy, it is a promise. No further words, just silence again, but this time a different kind of silence. It leaned forward. The document, drafted in secrecy over 6 months with legal scholars, survivors, and human rights leaders, bore the title Continental Principles for Civilian Protection. It wasn't a sweeping reform plan. It didn't require money or military. It simply laid out one truth long ignored. No political goal, no matter how noble, justifies the death of an unarmed civilian. And then Traore did something no one expected. He didn't ask for debate. He didn't push for a vote. He simply placed the document on a circular glass table, empty until that moment, and looked out across the hall. "I will not ask you to speak," he said. "I will only ask you to stand if you believe civilians should not die for the sake of power." The room froze. This wasn't procedural. It wasn't ceremonial. It was personal. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of the day lingered in every corner. Then President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana stood. Quietly, without looking at anyone, he approached the table, took the pen, and signed. No clapping, no music, just the sound of ink on paper. Then President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, then Angola's vice president. Then the foreign minister of Togo, one from Sudan, another from Côte d'Ivoire. Not in order of rank, not by alliance, by conviction. Traore waited. He didn't rush to be first. He let 14 leaders sign before stepping forward himself, as if to say, "This is not about me." When he finally added his name, the room didn't erupt. It held its breath. That night, for the first time in months, the continent's headlines did not begin with a coup or a scandal or an attack. They began with a signature. CNN Africa aired a full segment titled, "Captain Ibrahim, a Pact for the People." BBC Africa streamed the entire footage without interruption for 12 minutes, unusual for a summit feed. In the scrolling caption below, Burkina Faso, latest news, leadership by silence. Across the continent, something shifted. In Accra, bells rang from 3 churches. In Bissau, a mural was painted overnight, Traore's silhouette beside the words, "We signed for peace." In Bamako, once divided by unrest, students marched with signs, "Our leaders finally spoke." By midnight, 33 out of 55 AU member states had signed. But what moved observers most wasn't the number of signatures, it was why they signed. A delegate from Chad whispered before adding her name, "This is for my niece." A minister from Cameroon paused, fingers trembling before writing, "For the boy I couldn't save." This wasn't just geopolitics, it was grief. Written down. And for once the pen wasn't a symbol of bureaucracy, but of repentance. The next morning, in Ouagadougou's dry air, a bell rang softly at a school no one had heard of before. It was new, modest, built from red earth and the memory of one life. Above its entrance, a wooden sign painted by hand, Samuel Umar Memorial School. Inside, children lined up, uniforms, mismatched notebooks clutched like treasure. Some glanced at the bell with nervous eyes. Most looked at the man standing quietly near the gate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't giving a speech. He simply nodded, and a little girl stepped forward, took the rope, and rang the bell. Once, twice. The sound carried through mango trees and dry wind. It echoed not just through the schoolyard, but through a continent, not as victory, not as pride, but as a vow. 2 weeks after the summit in Addis Ababa, the United Nations General Assembly convened in New York. Delegates arrived as they always did, adjusting microphones, scrolling through talking points, arranging translation earpieces. Journalists primed their cameras. Analysts prepared for the usual dance of diplomacy statements, sideline agreements, rebuttals. But then something unexpected happened. As the African Union bloc entered the chamber, 21 member states strong, led by Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, South Africa. They didn't take their seats right away. They stood. No speeches, no slogans, just 2 full minutes of silence. No preamble, no. We come here today to just stillness. In a hall accustomed to noise, heated exchanges, applause, performative outrage, this silence hit like a wave. Murmurs rippled. Cameras zoomed in. Aides looked at each other, uncertain if something had gone wrong. But nothing was wrong. Everything was right. Behind the AU delegation, a row of small candles flickered on a digital screen. Each one glowed steadily, each one unnamed, yet deeply known. This was not absence. It was memory. And when Ghana's ambassador finally stepped to the microphone, she said only this. This is what remembrance looks like when it refuses to die. The room shaken clapped slowly, tentatively. Not because they understood everything, but because they felt something shift. In the hours that followed, the global press responded not with skepticism, but reverence. CNN's headline read, "Captain Ibrahim, the soldier who taught leaders to listen." BBC Africa ran a special titled, "From Dust to Doctrine, Burkina Faso and the Silence That Spoke." Within 4 days, the footage of that UN moment reached over 60 million views across platforms. In Dakar, a mural of Samuel Umar was painted next to a primary school. In Johannesburg, a city council meeting opened with the words, "For those we failed to protect." In Kampala, teachers led students in a morning minute of silence. No anthem, no instruction, just reflection. This ripple effect, the spreading ritual of quiet resistance, did not emerge from any Western initiative. It wasn't funded by a think tank. It wasn't televised because it fit a media cycle. It happened because one man chose to read a name instead of deliver a speech, and Americans noticed, especially those who had seen it before in different forms on different soils. Vietnam veterans wrote online, "I remember when silence was all we had left." Mothers who lost children in school shootings commented, "He read her name. We couldn't even get them to say ours." Seniors in Alabama, Pennsylvania, and Kansas shared the candlelight map from the AU summit on Facebook with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." Because for a generation of Americans who lived through the moral reckonings of Selma Kent State My Lai and 9/11 not all at once but slowly, painfully, they know what it means when grief is no longer buried beneath policy. They understand the cost of forgetting. They also know the power of bearing witness. And Traore didn't need to explain that to them. He just embodied it, even in his refusal to give victory speeches. Weeks after the summit, a BBC reporter caught up with him outside the new school in Ouagadougou. Children played behind him barefoot and laughing. The reporter asked, "Do you think this has changed Africa?" Traore didn't answer. He didn't need to. He looked at the children, then the school's modest red brick, then back at the camera. No slogans, no promises, just a gaze calm, steady, deeply human. And across the ocean, Americans, especially older ones, recognized that look. The look of someone who has seen pain, carried memory, and chosen to build anyway. It was the same look seen in the eyes of John Lewis as he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the same steadiness in the gaze of firefighters at Ground Zero, the same silence in the eyes of black mothers watching their sons leave home after curfew. Leadership by presence, not performance. In editorials, the New York Times wrote, "The African Union spoke louder in 2 minutes of silence than most nations do in an hour of words." A professor of African studies at Georgetown tweeted, "We teach Africa as a site of instability, but today they taught us dignity." And while the treaty signed in Addis Ababa wasn't binding by international law, it became morally irreversible. American diplomats privately praised it as a cultural doctrine of conscience. Even the State Department, often cautious in language, issued a rare acknowledgement. The African Union's recent summit signals a return to people-centered security. We recognize the courage shown. No meetings were canceled, no sanctions lifted. But something deeper happened. Respect was restored, not through lobbying, but through stillness. And perhaps that's what resonated most with American viewers, especially older ones. They know that sometimes the loudest moments in history begin in silence. Like the silent lunch counters of Greensboro, the quiet kneeling of Colin Kaepernick, the folded flags handed to grieving families. So when they saw Traore stand before a continent and say nothing but remember everything, they didn't just understand. They believed. It began with silence, not a pause in protocol, not a glitch in the system, but a rupture, a refusal. A moment when a continent looked away from podiums and toward the names we had buried too long. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not ask for applause. He didn't demand support. He asked for something much harder to remember, and in that remembering something broke and something began. The list of names wasn't a political tool. It was a resurrection. The candle wasn't decor. It was a rebellion. The empty chair wasn't symbolic theater. It was a seat reserved for every child who never made it home from school, for every mother who still waits for justice, for every voice drowned beneath headlines and hush. Across Africa, the silence spread not as absence, but as answer. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Addis Ababa to New York. Students lit candles. City councils observed minutes of mourning. Teachers read letters instead of textbooks. Diplomats paused before they spoke. Even long after the summit ended, the symbols remained. A white flag still flies above the AU gate. 3 ambassadors returned home carrying replicas of the empty chair, not for show, but for truth. In Johannesburg, school children crafted banners that read, "We sit for those who cannot stand." And perhaps most enduring of all, in the dry heat of eastern Burkina Faso, a small bell rings each morning at Samuel Umar Memorial School, not for ceremony but for future, because no bullet should silence a book. We must ask ourselves, what does it mean when a continent chooses to lead with grief, not greed? What does it mean when the loudest statement is not shouted but carried through the eyes, through memory, through stillness? And more personally, what name does your family still whisper at the dinner table? What story has never stopped aching in your chest? Whose justice are we still waiting for? Share that name below. Write their initials. Let the world see we remember, because this is not just a story of Africa. It's a story of what it means to be human in a time that has tried again and again to dehumanize us. It's about dignity as resistance, memory as defiance, silence as witness. Traore didn't change the world in one day, but he made it pause. He made power bend not out of weakness, but out of remembrance. And in that pause, many of us saw something we didn't know we needed. A future built not on victory speeches, but on letters from grieving mothers. A politics that begins not with control, but with compassion. A leader who speaks softly not because he lacks power, but because he honors the weight of pain. If this story moved something in your heart, don't scroll past. Write the name of someone you remember. Light a virtual candle in the comments. And if you believe as we do, that the future of Africa and the world belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who carry memory with dignity, then say it with us, Rise Africa. And if you feel like you've just witnessed something the world wasn't meant to forget, please share this video. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more powerful than the headlines, and never let silence mean erasure again, because they tried to hide our history long enough. Now let's speak our future out loud.